Well, thank you, Sam, for that reading. Acts 19, a dramatic passage, isn't it? Wonder how much control did you think that you had really over your life? 2020 has smashed away, hasn't it, any illusion that we have that we can control things. We have a glimpse of that here in Acts 19. The old Jewish saying, I'm sure you've heard it, man plans and God laughs, is so true, isn't it? Especially in 2020. Psalm 2 and Proverbs 19 seem to confirm that saying, man plans, God laughs, with a scriptural basis. We've seen so many of our plans being blown out of the water this year. I'm not sure that God has laughed about it, but 2020 has highlighted to you and to me that illusion of control that we have over our lives is just that. It is just an illusion, and God has smashed through that this year. We have come to realize that we cannot control our lives, and we cannot do all that we want, when we want, where we want. The fact that I am stood here alone and you're at home watching just proves all that. And we see a glimpse of it in our reading. Just a couple of verses earlier in chapter 19 of the book of Acts and verse 21, we read there that after all this had happened, so that's Paul preaching in Ephesus for 2 years, Paul decided to go to Jerusalem, passing through Macedonia and Achaia. After I've been there, he said, I must visit Rome also. He sent 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia, while he stayed in the province of Asia a little longer. Yes, he had to stay in the province of Asia a little longer. Why? Because as we'll see, as Paul plans, a riot happens. Paul has made these great plans. They are his plans, but they are also God's plans. He decided, in verse 21, or decided in the Spirit, or resolved in the Spirit. So this is something he is doing with God. He is praying about this. He is using his apostolic, sanctified good sense, if you like. But he doesn't have a vision of a man from Macedonia calling him at this point. He is planning in the Spirit. And then there's a riot. And Paul's plans are put on hold for a little while. You see, even the great apostle Paul is not in control. Jesus Christ is. He has planned, but he has to wait. He has to stay a little longer. Why? Well, best laid plans and all that, but a riot happens, and that changes everything. So what happened? Well, verse 23, we have a disturbance. Luke describes it in this way. About that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way. The way. That dramatic little verse, that verse which has a description of a great disturbance, and yet Luke describes the disturbance as being about the way. It's a beautiful description, isn't it? It's the third time that Luke uses this phrase to describe the church. A new way of salvation, a new church, a new way of life, a new way of following the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. It's a great description. It's a lovely way that Luke gives it to us here. A great disturbance, a riot, and it's about the way. Well, we are in, of course, Ephesus again this Sunday evening. This riot takes place in Ephesus. Ephesus was famous for the temple of Artemis, sometimes by the Romans called Diana, but it is Artemis. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And the temple of Artemis, this massive temple with a statue there of Artemis, is huge and is famous and is well known, and it gives Ephesus its identity, and it brings a lot of money in. And the temple there is far greater than the Acropolis in Athens. It's far bigger. It's a huge structure. And it gives the city its identity, and it brings some capitalism to the city as well. Now, we see here a man named Demetrius who comes into the story. He is, verse 24, a silversmith. What he does is he makes silver shrines of Artemis. That's his job. That's his livelihood. And he has a problem. He has, I don't know whether it's April, but he's looked at his year-end accounts, and he can see that the profit curve of his business is on the downward trend. He is making, because people are selling, less statues of and shrines then of Artemis. And so he determines to do something about it. It's not just Paul who has a plan, Demetrius plans as well. And Demetrius, in this passage, he organizes and he speaks. He gets the other silversmiths. He gets the other people who are involved, as it's said in the word, in the spin-off trades. The other trades who are affected by the way. They've been affected. And so he gets them all together. Demetrius is a first century union activist, and he calls the first ever TUC meeting. And Demetrius is the main spokesman as the organizer, and he reminds the other workers of how much money they make from this business, making and selling statues. Our trade is falling off because of that man, Paul, that preacher. He's convincing large numbers of people to stop buying shrines, to stop buying the Artemis statues. And because of that, our trade is being affected. It's hitting us in the pocket. That is Demetrius's argument. It's hurting us financially. We see that now. You see people arguing on social media against the lockdown and against further lockdowns. And what's the first argument they give? The economy. It may be a valid argument. It probably is, of course. Nothing new under the sun. Demetrius does the same thing. The first argument, this is costing us money. Our economy is failing. But he doesn't just stay there. It's not just hurting us financially. Demetrius doesn't stop. He continues to warn them that if Paul is allowed to continue, then their whole way of life will change. No one will worship Artemis in the temple anymore. Ephesus will be long forgotten in history. That's the worry. It makes them furious, and a riot starts. They grab two of Paul's companions, Gaius and Aristarchus, and they drag them off to the theatre. This huge amphitheatre in the center of Ephesus. There is chaos in the theatre. Paul wants to go to the theatre to help his companions, but the other disciples stop Paul from going. You'll make the situation worse, and you'll be in trouble, and you may be in danger. That's why they stop him. It's a great amphitheatre, and it can seat or hold thousands. I know because I've been there. It's worth visiting Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. You kind of have to get a taxi and everything up to the top of the hill, and you enter at the top of the hill, and you basically make your way down the valley of the ancient ruins of Ephesus. And eventually you get there to the amphitheatre, this huge theatre, which is a lot of it still remaining. And I stood there and pretended to be Paul preaching in the theatre. I've got Josh to film me and take some photographs of me pretending to be Paul. Of course, when you read Acts 19, you realize there's no evidence for him ever actually preaching in the theatre. But there you go. But it's a great amphitheatre, and chaos is reigning. People are shouting and everything else. And so what happens? Well, the next thing that happens is, in the midst of this chaos, the Jews that are there, and nobody knows why they're really there, but the Jews decide to do something about it. And they push forward a spokesman, Alexander. Why do they do that? Well, in the culture of the day, the pagan culture of Ephesus, the main real other religion that's been there a while, there's a synagogue there, was of course Judaism. The Jews were there. And as kind of foreigners, they would have been blamed for everything going on. And so the Jews want to defend themselves. And Alexander is pushed forward to defend themselves. And you can imagine the inference of what he's going to say. It's nothing to do with us. It's that man Paul. And he's nothing to do with us. Don't blame us. We've lived here for many years alongside you. We've never had any tensions. It's that newcomer Paul. He's been here for 2 years and look what's happened. That would be what Alexander's trying to say. Don't blame us. However, the mob stops Alexander from speaking when they find out that he's Jewish. And for 2 hours, the mob, the crowd, chant the name of Artemis. If you ever complain about Christian worship services being too long, perhaps you complain we've sung too many songs, perhaps you complain that the preacher goes on too long, well, I promise you I won't go on for 2 hours this evening, but in here, in Ephesus, they chant for 2 hours, over and over again. Great is Artemis. It's a 2-hour chant, so don't complain that our services are too long because they chanted for 2 hours. Well, that's a little aside for me to poke you with there. But what happens next? Well, eventually, after 2 hours of chanting, eventually a city official addresses the crowd and calms them down. And the city official stands up and says, well, these people haven't really done anything wrong, have they? But if they have, take them to the law courts. There is a better way. Here's the way. Take them to court. That's what you can do. He appeases the crowd. And then he addresses them about Artemis. Don't worry about Artemis. After all, you can't deny her power. You can't deny her miraculous nature. She fell to the earth from the sky. She will protect the temple. She will protect us. She will protect the city. Don't worry. You have nothing to worry about. We're under Artemis's influence and power and control. The crowd are dismissed and peace returns. Which leads us to the question about Artemis. Where is the temple today? It's in ruins. It's even historically unclear when the temple was actually destroyed. Nobody seems to know when it was destroyed or who by. And this is actually the second, at least the second version of the temple when Paul gets there, because in previous years it's been destroyed before already. And who worships Artemis today? And who worships Jesus Christ today? More people than ever before. Christ is building his church. You see the start of it here in Ephesus 2,000 years ago, just about. But he continues to do so. Long after Ephesus, his influence and identity has gone. It is just something for the history books and a nice place to visit when you're in Turkey. But apart from that, so what can you and I learn from first century Ephesus? What can we learn from a riot in first century Ephesus for us today? Well, the first thing is this: Christ affects culture. Christ affects culture. You see, the culture in Ephesus was very clearly pagan. The culture of the city was dominated by the worship of Artemis. Historians tell us that Artemis was a statue made out of cedar wood. She was made out of a tree. Somebody or some people have carved her out of a tree that was known, out of a tree type that was known, cedar wood. Everyone can see that. Everyone can touch that. Everyone knows that she's wood. And she was a fertility god who they believed gave the people of Ephesus protection. Of course, as I just mentioned, she'd already failed at least once because the temple had been destroyed and rebuilt at least once. She didn't work, she didn't provide them protection because she was literally wooden. But the temple worship and the worship of this statue of Artemis was famous. It gave the city of Ephesus its identity. Ephesus' identity was bound up in the temple and in Artemis the statue. It's what gave the city its name. It's what gave the city its culture. It's the reason that people came to the city, and it also made the people of the city lots of money. The silversmith and workers in related trade and the salesmen and everything else. Clearly, the industry of the day was the temple worship of Artemis. So what happens? Christ affects culture. Of course it does. You see, as with the rest of the book of Acts, we are again seeing an outworking of Acts chapter 1 verse 8. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria at the ends of the earth. Paul and the others, they go to Ephesus. The church is built. The power of the Holy Spirit is on them. They are witnesses in the ends of the earth, even Ephesus. And what happens? Jesus Christ is building his church. And as Christ builds his church, it affects the pockets of the silversmiths and related trades. It affects the pockets of the industry of the day, and Christ and the gospel and Christianity affects the culture of first century Ephesus. The culture begins to change. You see, Ephesus here is showing the implications of the gospel. The gospel, Christ, changes everything. We know that with a new birth, don't we? We are made new. We are new creations. The old is gone, the new has come. We are not as we were. We need to be, as Paul tells Nicodemus, born again. And as individual lives and individual people come to Jesus Christ, so individual people are changed. And the followers of Jesus Christ become more like him, more like Jesus. And so, of course, the gospel changes everything. Because as the church grows in Ephesus, as more and more people become witnesses of Jesus Christ, and as more and more people become more like Christ, then the influence of Christ grows. And it affects the way we see here, the way that people spend their money. People no longer are buying in the volumes that they once were these silver items, these silver shrines, these silver idols, these silver statues of Artemis. They're not being bought, and so they don't need to be made, and the profit margins are being cut, and the profits are going down, all because of Christ affecting the culture. Things are changing. That's the implication of the gospel of Christ. And things that the Ephesians were taking for granted were changing as well. The city clerk thinks that everything will always stay the same. That's the appeal of the city clerk. Doesn't all the world know the city of Ephesus, verse 35, is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image, which fell from heaven. Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to calm down and don't do anything rash. What's he saying? Well, everyone knows Ephesus. Everyone knows it's all about the temple and about Artemis. That's not going to change. It's undeniable it's not going to change. She fell from heaven. But it really doesn't last long at all. Because the thing that gave the city its identity and its industry was slowly going. Change is coming with one Christian convert at a time. And because of that, change is now inevitable because of Acts chapter 1 verse 8. The church of Jesus Christ is growing in Ephesus. And as each individual member is saved and changed, so the city is being changed and its culture is being changed bit by bit. Of course it would be. Of course. Look how radical Jesus is in his life. He eats with tax collectors and sinners. He preaches messages like the Sermon on the Mount, which is so unlike anything else that was heard in the day. The way of Jesus, you may think, is radical today. We live in a society, as we'll see in a moment, which has been kind of Christianized over centuries. This is first century, completely pagan culture, and Christ's influence comes into it for the first ever time. Of course, Christ is going to affect and change the culture. And this year we're seeing the beginning of the change process, because the culture doesn't change overnight. It's a drip, 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 one by one conversion change. Read an article on the BBC website yesterday about the Pilgrim Fathers sailing to America on the Mayflower. It was quite a good article, and it was basically talking about how Americans often misinterpret the influence of the Pilgrim Fathers, and he was kind of trying to narrow it down and show that the influence wasn't the same as the founding fathers politically, and so the things that were different. But he was basically saying the main influence that the Mayflower settlers have on America is the Protestant work ethic that they brought with them. That everything that they did, including work, was done for the glory of God. It drove people on as America became the massive nation that it became. That it was that work ethic, that Christian basis, which drove the culture. And the article was making the point today that in America, of course, Americans generally don't have very long holidays each year. They only have a week or two's holiday. The rest of the time, they spend working. They have in America far less holidays than we do over here. Why? Well, he was tracing it back to the Protestant work ethic of the Pilgrim Fathers. The Christian, Christ, affecting the culture. You see, one apple tree in a huge field doesn't change the nature of the field, does it? But when there are more and more apple trees being planted and growing in the field, the more and more apple trees that there are, well, the more likely that that field becomes an orchard. Its nature, its culture, its existence changes. That's what happens in Ephesus. What about us in Wales? Do you understand the culture of 21st century Wales and Britain? We live in days, as we'll see in a moment, where culture is shifting and changing. Is it for the better or not? Well, hindsight is always a great thing to look at. But we see, first of all, anyway, Christ and culture. Second thing we see is this: Christ attracts conflict. Christ and Christians, his followers, attract conflict. Of course. Of course, because Christ brings change, and Christianity brings change. And as a human race, we don't like change. We may say that we do, but we naturally reject change. Even though those who say they love change complain. Remember, many years ago, preaching in a church, and I was invited there because I had relatives there, and I asked for an order of service before the service started, and they just gave me a sheet of paper with a load of songs on it, and it was a lot. It wasn't 2 hours of chanting, but there was a lot of songs on there. And so they said, just split them up as you want and read and pray and everything else and preach. But do whatever you want. We like change here. We like things to be different every week. And so I did. I had a few songs and I prayed and I had a few more songs and blah, blah, blah. End of the service, somebody comes up to me. Thanks for this morning. But just to say that we normally have 3 songs in there. You see, I changed something. In the midst of this kind of supposed chaos and state of flux, and we like change, I changed something and they didn't like it. Why? We don't like change. We resist change, especially when things are important to us. And that shouldn't surprise us. Jesus Christ comes into the world and he attracts conflict. Satan and the world does not like Jesus and doesn't like the followers of Jesus. They try to get rid of Jesus and his influence by crucifying him. Remember, Jesus is the miracle worker. Jesus is the one who is healing the sick, who is making the deaf to hear and the mute to speak and the blind to see. Who wouldn't want somebody like that in your town? Yet, They reject Jesus and crucify him because he attracts conflict. Why? Because he brings change. Because he's the Son of God who comes into the world to save sinners. And they tried to get rid of the influence of Christ by crucifying him, and nothing has changed. Here in Ephesus, they tried to get rid of the influence of Christ and of Christianity, and the same is so often true today. You see, today in our culture, we are living in a day when we have the benefits and the blessings of a Christian culture in the West without the foundation block of Christ and Christianity. It's one of the reasons why we live in days of so much confusion. It's why we live in days when there is so much tension, when we're living in days when there's so much kind of radicalism, why we live in days of so much kind of elite liberalism on one hand and kind of staunch conservatism on the other, or days of radical left-wing and radical right-wing. Tom Holland is a historian. He's not yet a Christian, but he's written a very helpful, though very long read and not the easiest book to read, but it's a book called Dominion. And he is charting the rise of Christianity in the West and the rise of Christianity's influence in the West. He's not yet a Christian, but he's clearly very sympathetic. And he is charting the dominion of what happens when Christian thought and influence and culture gain the dominion. What happens? And he charts all the blessings and benefits that Christianity has brought. And the things that you and I take for granted today are based on Christianity. And based on Christians putting the Word of God into action in their daily lives. And our culture is still based upon those things, or living with the benefits of those things, and we want the fruits, but we don't want the foundation anymore. Quite funnily, a few months ago, he was in a debate, Tom Holland again. As I say, he's not yet a Christian, but he was debating with a strident kind of atheist. And the atheist was basically saying this, I've studied Christianity and I've studied culture and the West and everything else. And I struggle to see, he says, just one area where Christianity has affected to the good the Western world. And without even thinking of it, quite humorously, Tom Holland lists 7 things off the top of his head that Christianity has given us. Well, equality and human rights and things like that. The abolition of the slave trade is a completely Christian thing. No other culture would ever want to do that. But of course, Wilberforce and the other Christians who supported him and encouraged him and challenged him, they wanted to abolish slavery, didn't they? Because they could see from the Word of God that everyone is made in the image of God. That whatever our color of our skin, whatever language we speak, whatever the color of our hair, etc., whether we are male or female, that we are all made in the image of God and have that inherent dignity because of that foundational truth. But of course now we live in a cancel culture where we want to get rid of the foundation block of Christianity and just have those things like human rights that come and spring from those things. And people want to get rid of our Christian history and the foundation and just have the blessings and benefits. That's why there's a culture war going on now. That's why people didn't want to sing, and there was a debate for the last night at the proms, should we sing those old songs? But the truth, of course, is that it was the Christianity and the fact that he was a Christian of Wilberforce and others drove them in Parliament for the abolition of slavery, and the fact that Britain ruled the waves meant that those slave trade ships could be stopped by British Admiralty. God did all that. And he does it through individual Christians who have changed the culture of the day. And our culture wars that are going on, the extremes that we are seeing, are because Christ affects the culture. And when culture starts to change, and when people's lives are challenged, well, of course, Christ attracts conflict. Now, it's easy as we look at Acts 19 to criticize Demetrius and the mob, but their jobs and their culture, their real identity as Ephesians, are being eroded by the influence of Christ and Christianity. We don't seem to have that with the church today, do we? Why is there no conflict intellectually with the church? Is it because you and I are not Christ-like enough? Are we swimming with the tide of pagan materialist culture, or are we swimming against it? What is our object of worship intellectually? What is our temple of Artemis intellectually? Is it Parc y Scarlets, formerly Stradey Park? Is it the Welsh language? Is it the culture of the Eisteddfod? Is it the culture of Welsh rugby or football or sport or whatever it is? What identifies you? What defines you? You see, what happens when we put things above the Lord, before the Lord? They're idols, aren't they? What happens when the Lord convicts you of something in our culture that you are putting before him? What are you putting before the Lord? What are you saying? I can't live without that. Demetrius and the others are not subtle, are they? We can be very subtle with our objects of worship. How much of our Welsh identity and culture do we put before the gospel? What of our culture will stand? Parc y Scarlets, Stradey Park rather, is now just a housing estate, isn't it? The Vetchfield in Swansea is just an allotment and a little park. Those things, those monuments that we think will stand forever have gone, haven't they? And we see it the same with church buildings. Church buildings all eventually are demolished because it's just bricks and mortar. But the church of Jesus Christ stands. Cultural things go because culture is changed by Christ. Well, the third thing we see then this evening is this: Christ, culture, and you. You see, your and my aim tonight is not that we are to change the culture. As followers of Jesus Christ, that's not our big aim. It's not to Christianize, if you like, the culture of the West. That can be an idol. We can look back and say, well, it was in the 1950s or 20s or whatever it was, when the culture was different. It was so much better then. It was so much easier to become a Christian and to be a Christian and to live as a Christian. Things were so much easier in those days. That can be idolatrous, can't it? We want an easy life as a Christian. That's not the call of the New Testament. And it's not the call of the New Testament to change culture. According to 2 Peter 3:18, your goal is always to be growing in grace and the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Your and my aim is to be more Christ-like, to live as salt and light wherever God has put us, in the family, in the workplace, in our friends' setting, in the clubs that we are in and the places that we visit and things like that. We are to act as salt and light, yes, we are. And to be more and more Christ-like. But the changing culture is the byproduct of you and I being the followers of Jesus Christ that we are called to be. You see, Paul doesn't go to Ephesus to stop silversmiths from making shrines and to stop people worshipping Artemis. Paul is going there to tell people about Jesus Christ so that the people of Ephesus will worship Jesus. When they start worshiping Jesus, the byproduct, the byproduct is the culture will change because people will stop worshiping Artemis. That is inevitable, but it's not the goal. The goal for you and me is to be more like Jesus, to live more like Jesus, to live the Sermon on the Mount, to spend more time eating with tax collectors and sinners, to live by the Spirit so that we will produce the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The more people who live like that, then the quicker the culture changes around us. You see, the city is changed because Paul and the others lived to a Christ in a Christ-like way and told others of Jesus Christ. They lived and spoke, as Philippians put it, they shone like stars in the night sky as they held out the word of truth. They're living as the best ambassadors of Jesus Christ that they can be. Will the culture of Llanelli change as a result of us living Christ-like lives? That's our concern, to live as the best ambassadors of Christ that we can possibly be, and leave the rest to God. You see, we plan, God laughs. God's plans always come into fruition. Why? Because he's God. And we are in his hands. And we are in his plans. And you and I plans should be to be as Christ-like as we can possibly be. And let God do the rest. We started off by saying, didn't we, Paul and Demetrius both making plans. The riot comes in the midst of all these plans, but what does it change? It's just a reminder that Jesus is still on the throne, that God is on the throne. Jesus is the King of Kings. Jesus is the Lord of all, because Ephesus is now just a place of ruins that is worth seeing and worth visiting. But the legacy of Paul's message of the gospel of Jesus Christ is that there is a Christian church around the world. Why? Because it's the power of God. It's the power of the Holy Spirit. Christ is building his church. That is God's plan. And God's plan, despite a riot, they always come to fruition. Do you know that? Trust that you will know that tonight. That we commit our plans to him, but our plan for this week, be the very best ambassador for Jesus Christ that you can be. And let's see what Jesus does in Llanelli and in Wales and in our Western world.